this issue is not about Putin. And, for those who didn't catch the joke, the Black Russians is a joke. It's important to keep some kind of levity, even in the midst of serious repression from the state, because you have to hold on to your humanity when it's being attacked. And really, this censorship from the state that actually happened without any notification, no fanfare, no nothing. Our podcasts were on Spreaker and Spotify and Apple iTunes yesterday, and friends of the show, listeners, called in or sent us messages on Facebook or through Twitter saying, I was listening to your podcast and it cut off in the middle, and I went back to reload it and it's gone. So that's how we knew that our content had been taken down from these podcast platforms. And it's very interesting that we, two Marxist, Leninist, socialist, Black organizers, Black radicals who focus on the liberation struggles of working class, poor, and oppressed people in this country, and connecting those struggles to working class, poor, oppressed, and colonized people around the world. It's interesting and telling and indicative of just who gets targeted when the fascism of the state is deployed in full force. Because let's be clear, censoring the media, quelling the alleged First Amendment rights, and crushing dissent, that is fascism. Absolutely, that is an aspect of fascism. And it's interesting that it is we Black radicals who are at the forefront of this fascism. Our voices of not just anti-war, but anti-imperialism. And I think that's an important distinction that we must make, because it's one thing to be opposed to war, and that's great, and everyone should be opposed to war. But when we talk about anti-imperialism, we are talking about getting at the root of why war happens and who causes it and for what reason. So those are the things we talk about on our show, the root cause of the suffering of all working class, poor, oppressed, and colonized people around the world. War is one of those ways that suffering is meted out, but we focus on who causes it. And in the world today, it is the United States, through its international militarized gang called NATO, that is at the bottom and at the forefront and in the middle of every conflict in the world today, where people are challenging the repression of the state, not providing for the people's needs, are exploiting people's labor and stealing their land for their resources. And as we see in Ukraine, fomenting a coup in 2014, arming and legitimizing neo-Nazis, putting them in the government, allowing them to go into the army, unleashing them to wage a civil war on ethnic Russians in Crimea and Donbass for 8 years, all while increasing NATO exercises in countries that border Russia for 8 years, ever increasing, deploying more weapons in those countries on the border where NATO was not supposed to advance to in the first place, and now using Ukraine as the last piece in the game of chess, the global hegemonic chess that the US and NATO has been playing. So it's interesting that it is we Black radicals who get censored, along with everyone else on the platform, but particularly when we talk about fascism and the way not only people in this country are downplaying the US NATO role in Ukraine, but they're also downplaying the presence of fascism, the presence of fascists, the role of fascists in what is going on in Ukraine. And this is not something that is just limited to the people of Morocco and Brazil and India and Nigeria and other African nations and some Caribbean nations who were brutally denied exit from Ukraine during because of course that's who would not be surprised that that is how fascists would act. But it's particularly insulting to Black people in this country who our family members, our grandfathers, our granduncles were convinced that if we fought for this country in World War II against fascists in Europe, against Hitler and against Ito, then things would be better here. But our family members went to Europe, fought fascists there, were tasked with guarding the former Nazi soldiers who were POWs, experienced them being treated better than they were in their own so-called country. And now this very country, once again, is saying to us, no, the fascism isn't real. That's a grave insult to the legacy of many of our people. And that is, it's a rare occasion that I will make things personal, but it's a grave insult to me, where my own grandfather fought in World War II. As much as I am an anti-imperialist and wish he hadn't gone, but he did. And it is a grave personal insult for me to hear people, some even on the so-called left, who say that the fascist threat in Ukraine is not that big. The fascist influence in Ukraine is not that big. Putin is really the problem. So this moment is very important because as an African in America, I recognize that very often we are used as pieces in this chessboard, in this game. We are used by the Democratic Party to prop up candidates that have no legitimacy otherwise, as was done with Russiagate. There was a lot of focus on Black folks and how evil mastermind Putin snookered us all to either vote for Hillary Clinton or not vote for Hillary Clinton or vote for Donald Trump with some Facebook ads for shoes and, rainbow bikini Bernie ads. We Black folks were supposed to have been so unsophisticated that we fell for Putin's ruse that we were duped into voting for Trump, or at least not voting for Clinton. Then for 6 years, we heard nothing but, look at how Putin fooled the Black people through Russiagate. And then we had another 4 years of Putin colluding with Trump, or Trump colluding with Putin. And we just got this barrage of Putin. He's our problem for 8 whole years. The entire time there's a civil war going on in Ukraine, fomented by Barack Obama and Joseph Biden, John McCain, Victoria Nuland, with weapons from NATO not being reported in the news at all. All of the struggles of working class, poor and oppressed Black, Latinx, and other people, LGBTQ people, completely ignored here domestically. But the defense budget increases. Joe Biden is elected because, look, you have to vote for him because we have to get rid of Trump, because we have to protect the Black people that Trump is going after. Once again, we're used as pawns in this game of imperialism. And now at the end of this, and it may not be the end of this, and now we are told, the very same people used by the Democratic Party we're the patsies for why Hillary lost. We're the reasons that people have to vote for Joe Biden, who said he wasn't going to do anything for anyone anyway. And now here we are 2 years into Biden's administration being told by Biden's administration and many of the people who said that we had to vote for him, to get rid of Trump, to protect the least among us. Now Biden and all of those people are saying, you don't see fascism in Ukraine. It's not that big of a deal. You're exaggerating. So all of these things are incredibly important, along with the history of this coup in 2014 and where it fits in the larger strategy of the US and the EU and NATO in regard to certainly China, but also the way the media, as you said at the beginning, fell all in immediately to making this about Putin. It's all Putin. Putin must be stopped. That could only have happened if the 6-year media campaign of the Putinization of the American consciousness was played endlessly throughout corporate media platforms every day, 24 hours a day for 6 years. So this is where we are. This is the result of that, where so-called people on the left or anti-war people or progressive people are even saying Putin must be stopped. And let's not worry about the fascists in Ukraine, and NATO is not the problem, it's Putin. So these kinds of conversations are very important to have, because we will never have peace in this world unless NATO is disbanded and the empire of the US is stopped. Yeah, that's a very important question. And for me, as a Pan-Africanist and as an anti-imperialist, it's very important, because when you understand that imperialism, US, NATO imperialism, their axis of domination along with the EU, are the reason students from many countries on the continent and throughout the Caribbean are studying in places like Ukraine. It's because it's less expensive to go to Western style universities in Ukraine than it is to go to a university anywhere else in Europe. But why, you have to ask yourself, why are students needing to go outside of their own countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Somalia, or anywhere in the Caribbean to get an education, Brazil? Well, first, I think you have to look at the governments of some of those countries. We certainly know that the government in Nigeria is a comprador class of the United States, fully in support of the United States. You look at the government of Brazil, that is a right-wing puppet of the United States, a proxy state, if you will, of the US. And then you see that this is not an issue. These many students, most of them are students, but not all of them are, but most are students. Then you see that we have a situation where imperialism has created conditions where people in their home countries cannot afford to get a decent education, number one. But then the question of what is a decent education? Well, the decent education is dictated by the imperialist powers that controls the system in that country. So you have young people who believe that their education from a European university will hold more weight in the capitalist markets of the world than a degree from the University of Ghana, the university in Somalia, or the University of Sao Paulo, or such along those lines. So there is that aspect. The question of why are African and Brazilian and Caribbean people students in Ukraine, and certainly I'm not taking away anyone's agency to go wherever they choose to receive an education. But I think we'd be mistaken if we don't look at the conditions under which people feel they must go to another country to receive something that they think is better, that is offered in their country, and who's dictating those terms and why. So the idea of a better education in a European nation is a very colonial white supremacist idea, right? So there is that. And then we have the clear, obvious racist treatment of non-European people who were trying to leave Ukraine. And there has been a lot of conjecture about, well, no, it was the Polish, border guards, and it was the Hungarian border guards who weren't allowing people to come into their countries. And while I certainly don't dismiss that there was some of that, when we're talking about what the US, EU, and NATO did in Ukraine by propping up their puppet government and using the neo-Nazi, fascist, ultra-nationalist elements in that country to do that, then I am curious to know where people think those folks went, right? And I know that NATO itself knows very well where they went, because NATO actually has its own little propaganda arm called the Atlantic Council. They have a website. You can go to their website. It's a think tank, and they have their own little propaganda outlet. And even they acknowledge the presence and the threat of neo-Nazis, fascists, and ultra-nationalist groups in the military in Ukraine. They acknowledged it as early as 2018. And there's an article that is on their website that is actually titled something like Ukraine's Neo-Nazi Problem, quotation mark, no, this was not written by RT, end quotation, but that is the literal title of the article almost. And I mentioned it in a piece I wrote about this for the Black Agenda Report. So the Atlantic Council, NATO itself, recognizes that they have a Nazi problem in Ukraine. This does not legitimize anything that NATO does. It does raise this interesting contradiction, I think, for me, why people who are so all in for imperialism and so all in for the legitimacy of NATO, and NATO has to do the things it does because of Putin, all of a sudden they see no Nazis. But the very institution that armed and legitimized the Nazis, the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, they see them. So I think we have to be very clear that certainly the issue of white supremacy, neo-Nazism, fascism, ultranationalism, absolutely it exists in every country. There are extremist elements in every country. The entire issue with the so-called Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang really stems from China responding to extremist threats on their border that you never hear about in the United States. And there's no genocide. There is just providing an opportunity for people who felt marginalized to be integrated into society. That's what, so yes, that there is, I'm sure there is a fascist problem in Poland. I'm sure there's a fascist problem in Hungary. I am sure there is a fascist problem in Russia. I know this is true because there's a fascist problem in the United States. And so this is not something I am confused about, that there are other countries in the region that are welcoming sometimes of these fascist elements and have had issues with some of these fascist elements. But when Vladimir Putin, and I do not like to individualize this issue, but when Vladimir Putin says, we need to denazify Ukraine, and NATO itself says through the Atlantic Council, yes, we've got a Nazi problem, even though, of course, they come short of saying, and we created it, in Ukraine. We gave them weapons and, we allowed them to be members of the government. Then I question the seriousness of people's understanding of NATO and the US and the EU's role in this conflict. And I question people's seriousness to their commitment to anti-fascism. I truly do, because I often ask, and I've had a lot of these conversations over the past few days, I often ask people, how much fascism is acceptable for you? How much fascism are you willing to live with? Because for people who look like me, for people who look like those folks trying to leave Ukraine, those non-European folks, for people, for the ethnic Russian-speaking people in the Crimean and Donbass regions, for our LGBTQIA brothers and sisters, I can tell you that we cannot tolerate a tiny bit of fascism. But since we live in the country where I would argue fascism was probably born, modern fascism was born, I understand why we are confused by these things. We are intentionally propagandized into narrowing the focus of what fascism really is and who is really behind it by making one person the strong man, the boogeyman. That is not the issue here. And so I want to also say that understanding the imperialist underpinnings of why students from so many countries are in Ukraine to study, and their treatment by the imperialist actions of US and NATO, it also connects me and my struggles and the struggles of colonized people in the United States, because we are a domestic colony here, African people in the United States. This is another way that we connect. We are shown to be connected to the struggles of working class, poor, and oppressed people on the continent, and throughout the global South, Cuba and Venezuela, and Haiti, and yes, Iran, and then China, absolutely. So the idea that there is any allegiance with this settler colonialist, white supremacist, patriarchal project called America that will somehow benefit me as someone whose ancestors were the people who literally helped build this nation, that is a false relationship. Because if I were American, I wouldn't have to be fighting for my rights still in this country. I didn't say that, Malcolm X did. So I understand that my allegiance is not to America or Americanism or American exceptionalism or the United States, and it certainly is not an allegiance with the US and its imperialist hegemonic pursuits through its white supremacist militarized international gang, NATO, and its complicit actors, the European Union. My alliance is not with those people. My alliance and my connection is shown through these conflicts. My connection with the people who are in the crosshairs of these conflicts is shown through these contradictions that we raise. The fact that the United States bombed Somalia just a few days ago, also imposed sanctions on Somalia for moving the date of an election. I would like to know who is going to impose sanctions on anyone in the United States for closing down polling stations, moving early voting days, denying mail-in voting. Who is imposing sanctions on any of the governors who do that? This government was supportive of the bombing of Gaza just a few days ago, and the continued brutalization and repression of those people in the apartheid state of Israel. Who is posing sanctions on anyone who continues to prop up modern day redlining, all manner of segregation, de facto segregation in this country, all of the racial disparities that continue to exist? Who's going to sanction the United States for these things? Exactly. And my allegiance is certainly to the people on the continent of Africa, the working class and poor and peasant class of people on the continent who struggled against NATO before AFRICOM existed. NATO was pre-AFRICOM. So it is difficult, and I will admit, it is difficult not to personalize my responses, because this is not about, how Jacqueline Luqman feels. This is about the struggle against imperialism and the way it robs the freedom and life and the very existence of working class, poor, and oppressed and colonized people around the world. But I always feel like I have to make it clear, especially in these days, where my personal allegiances lie. And it is not ever with any formation that feels that it needs to identify with this white supremacist settler colonial experiment, America, in order to get a few trinkets from its table. My sentiments and allegiances lie with the oppressed and colonized people of the world who are struggling against and are rising up against this imperialist beast and the US, EU, NATO axis of domination. So that is where we connect with the people trying to flee, the African and Caribbean and Brazilian and Indian people trying to flee Ukraine. And just one more last point. Another way that we see how imperialism has operated in these countries, where people who are trying to flee these African nations, Caribbean nations, is the inability of their embassies to do anything to help them. The entire point of having an embassy is supposed to be to protect you wherever you go around the world. That's why you have an embassy. These embassies have not been able to protect or provide any assistance to these Africans, these Ghanaians, Nigerians, wherever they came from on the continent. I think Nigeria was the only embassy that was really able to do much of anything. But there is absolutely a reason why particularly the African embassies, the embassies from African nations, were powerless to do much to help their own people get home. That is because the US and NATO have rendered them powerless through neocolonization and continued imperialism and Western hegemony on their in their regions. So what we are looking at is almost the entire ecosystem of imperialism playing out before us, not only from in the way that it affects the people in the region, but also in the way we USians respond here, because now, people have so much sympathy and they're so concerned for the Ukrainians. And of course, I do not want anyone to experience the conflict of war. But I do wonder where people's concern was for the people in Somalia. I wonder where people's concern was for the people in Yemen. Where was people's concern for the people in Libya who experienced a new modern day slave trade after the US overthrow and assassination of Muammar Gaddafi? Where was people's concern for the End SARS protest in Nigeria over the past few years? We colonized people of the world, we peasant classes, we working class, poor and oppressed people of the world are always in the crosshairs of imperialism. I would just hope that imperialism becomes the issue, the main contradiction for people to struggle against, rather than a side discussion that we might be able to have when we stop this particular strongman from doing whatever it is the US government claims he's doing. About the anti-communism, this again is such an important part of the history of liberation struggle for African people, because the communist label was usually used to discredit Black people who were struggling for self-determination. You brought up Thomas Sankara and so many other African leaders who struggled to loose their chains from their colonial masters and choose for themselves, once they were pursuing that freedom from colonialism, what was the system most of them chose? The Thomas Sankaras, the Samora Machels, the Patrice Lumumbas, and what was the system they chose? It was socialism. And for many African leaders, it was scientific socialism. They did look to countries or formations like the USSR and China as models, perhaps for assistance. But they understood that their historical struggle against colonization and the class stratification, the worker and peasant exploitation, and the class oppression that came with colonialism in particular throughout history needed to be factored into how they structured their societies based on Marxist-Leninist principles. So yes, they may be Marxist-Leninists at the foundation, but they looked back at history, what colonialism did, how it happened, what it impacted, to inform how they would structure their socialist society. So, Sarah said that capitalism is not natural. It is not a natural system. So then you have to ask yourself, if capitalism isn't a natural system, then what is? Communalism. Communalism is the natural system, economic, if you want to call it that, but usually it is the natural system of indigenous people. And unfortunately, this is yet another what do I want to call it? Another example of the effects of being a colonized people in this country, where the violence and the outlet of colonized and oppressed people. This is what happens. But if capitalism is not natural, then communalism is the natural formation of indigenous societies. And while there were hierarchies that were adopted where there was a tribal leader or a king or some such thing, the idea of capitalism was something that was uniquely framed from a very European mindset. So when we look at why communism is still such an effective tool for propagandizing people against Putin, who, by the way, has now been turned Asian by the Financial Times. If you look at I think it's the Financial Times that has a picture of him with I guess it's a Mongolian Hun helmet on, and they're saying that Putin has gone back to his Asian roots. So now Putin isn't white anymore. He isn't European anymore. He's Asian, and it's okay to hate him because he's not European now. And he's a communist, even though he's not. He is very much a capitalist. He is an oligarch, and he's fine with that. But there are oligarchs in this country as well. So communism and the idea of anti-communism works so well because people in this country and in European nations are very much still invested in capitalism. The idea that capitalism is the root to health, wealth, and well-being and all things good in these respective countries. And of course, this is the exceptionalism that we're indoctrinated with. So the idea of the natural indigenous ordering of societies, these ideas of communalism are discredited and have been throughout history. They're discredited from the decimation of so many indigenous Native American societies who were almost eradicated from existence and forced into this capitalist system and impoverished because of it. And you look at the continent of Africa and you see all of the kingdoms before colonialism, they suffered the same fate. You look at communities in the global South, they suffered the same fate everywhere in the world, where communities ordered themselves, societies ordered themselves in a communal fashion. were eventually supplanted by European colonialism based on capitalism. And capitalism exists for the profit of a few through the exploitation of many. That is not natural, but capitalists do not care that is not natural. So the reason communism works so well is because we still want to get the bag, to be honest. We still think that our liberation will come through chasing the bag. And, if we can get enough exposure and enough likes and enough followers and get enough Patreons and, get into the right think tank and, get enough letters behind our name and make enough money, then we will be free. But in a capitalist system, none of us are free. The only people who are free are the ones who are at the very top. And in a certain way, even they are chained to this ideology of capitalism because they have to oppress and kill so many of us to continue to make the money that they do. But our concern cannot be with those at the top because they're not hurting. Our concern has to be with freeing those at the bottom. And while for me, I have to say that the Black Alliance for Peace is not a socialist formation. The Black Alliance for Peace has no political ideology. It subscribes to no political ideology. The Black Alliance for Peace exists to revive the Black radical anti-war, anti-imperialist tradition. That is why we exist. But personally, I would love to evangelize all of my working class, poor, oppressed, and colonized people to socialism. That may not happen. That is okay. But what I do want to make sure that we do is that we evangelize to those people that they can struggle against this system. They are power. The power is in the masses, and we can win. Now, if we don't struggle, we do not deserve to win. But if we struggle, we dare to win. And I believe we can.